So a viewer of mine, Emperor of Lols, recommended that I make a video on a blog post by Jay Shia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The blog's name is Exploring Believability on blogspot.com. This particular post was about Ludonarrative Dissonance, which I've already made videos on. So let's see what this guy has to say. In conventional terms, there are two parts of a game, or interactive experience. There is the mechanical aspect, the game, and the narrative aspect, the story. Some people are confused about the relation between these two things, and I have a lot of time on my hands after writing literally every possible thing about believability that I could, so here we are again, doing this same old song and dance one last time, before I do it all again next week. I'm not entirely sure you're qualified to talk about the conventional terms used in this subject matter, as much has been written on it, and it doesn't appear you've read much, if any of it. But let's not make arguments of authority. I'm not going to be responding to any of this from a ludologist or a narratologist perspective, because I think both fields are fundamentally limiting. To start with, I feel it necessary to point out that the concept of what a game is getting pretty nebulous. Proteus, Dear Esther, Gone Home, Passage, The Stanley Parable, The Walking Dead, etc. have spurred such attempts to redefine what exactly a game is, and as far as I'm aware, no one has come up with a satisfactory definition. It's the same thing that happens when people like Bill Nichols try to talk about genre. They get laughed at by people who know better. Maybe I should do a video about Bill Nichols at some point. Hey, remember when I said this?
But an important part, and perhaps the most important part of an argument, is considering every possible exception to your claim. If you find even one that your argument can't refute, you need to go back and rethink your position.
Yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. To start with, let's identify the two major parts of an interactive experience or game. The first part, the mechanical game aspect, is what we call the sport. The second part, the narrative story aspect, is what we call the story. Now, I hold issue with your two parts of a game. Al Russell and I are in agreement when he made his video about this very debate. It's not so much about the narrative or the gameplay. It's about the narrative elements and the interactive elements, and how each individual one corresponds to every other one. Here's a video elaborating on that. Wait a minute, I made a video on that. Here's mine too. And I would like to point out that there's already a word within the field you're attempting to discuss. It's called gameplay, and ludologists have defined it pretty well. Anyway, let's move on to your second paragraph. Sport is a term I'm using not only because of its structural connotations, sports having rules and regulations that exist on their own terms, but also because the implications of its etymology. While today we associate sports with highly structured team experiences connecting with physical exertions and capabilities, the origins of the word is actually much simpler. Sorry, not to nitpick, but sports aren't always team-based. One example is tennis. The word comes from the French désporter, meaning diversion or amusement. No, seriously, look it up. The definition dates back to the 1400s, and as play became more structured, it took its modern meaning. The point here is that sport is a term I'm using because sports are done for fun or enjoyment. There's a big push in the study of game design to stop using the word fun as a catch-all term to describe a game, the goal of a game, or the reason why we interact with them. Instead, we use the word engaging because fun implies a jovialness that isn't necessary to all games. This relates in turn to the role of sport in game. Sport is the rules for playing a game. Alright, now you're talking about mechanics and not gameplay. Which is it? Are we talking about the experience or the elements that contribute to the experience? I'm confused. Sometimes these rules intersect with the greater rules of the game/joke that we call reality. Sometimes they don't. Now, when you say this, I think of three things. First, I think of the Vsauce video on Is Life a Game? And while it was working with a coupling of flawed definitions for what a game is, it was certainly interesting. Secondly, I think of when I was in 3rd grade and my dad was helping me edit my paper. He told me that you don't actually have to write the slash, you just put a slash mark. Every teacher and professor since then seems to have agreed with him. Lastly, I think a discussion of ludonarrative dissonance, as silly as that phrase ultimately is an extremely odd place to act nihilistically, but let's move on. Yes, it's true. A work in any media doesn't have to abide precisely by the rules of reality. There are ways in each medium that realism is upheld, and there are ways to subvert it. This is a correct statement. Story is a simulation of actions in a usually consistent universe. Characters, events, and settings make up the foundation of a story, which is reinforced with dialogue, graphics, sound, etc. Narrative. Sorry, I had something in my throat. Story serves as a horrific, misshapen skin suit crudely fashioned to cover the sports experience. It is a tattered and baggy object that nonetheless adds appeal to the sports experience despite clearly not fitting on it and ultimately being a terrifying funhouse mirror of real life. It does? Can you substantiate? Like, give me an example? I can think of a few games where aspects of the narrative kind of didn't work with some of the interactive elements in a kind of grotesque way. Not all of them, though. Wolf Among Us is pretty darn internally consistent, so is Minecraft, State of Decay, Bioshock, Knights of the Old Republic, Halo, Fallout, Planescape Torment, Arkham Asylum, Guitar Hero, Metro 2033, To the Moon, Mass Effect 1, Portal. I'm just sorry, are you really going to leave that generalization just hanging there? Honestly, I feel like I'm arguing with Bill Nichols here, which kind of ties into the following tirade. An example of story is a reflexive point-and-click experience being converted into a murder simulator where players pretend to kill other human beings while gun companies make real-life profits from their guns being represented in the game as largely unrelated numbers and objects. If the story was not there, players would simply be launching projectiles at each other, and other players hit by the projectiles would be briefly removed from play for several seconds. Without the facade of shooting other human beings until they die, it's impossible to see this sport as being appealing. So the story doesn't fit, and it doesn't fit because it's a demented version of real life. But if the story wasn't there, then the game would have non-representative shapes shooting non-representative projectiles at each other. But that would be boring, so we need to be shooting other people to be engaged by the gameplay. What? That's the literal definition of a non sequitur. So, shooting humans in the gameplay is unappealing, but without shooting humans, the game doesn't appeal to you. Got it. Oh my goodness, that's almost as shocking as actors making real-life profits from portraying murderers in fiction. Shame on you, Wesley Snipes. Shame on you. Having such terrible actions represented in a fictional environment is the worst thing anyone can do. Other people will see this and go kill multiple armed thugs with machetes. Don't believe me that he's implying this will cause violence? Listen to the next paragraph. Hey, do you remember that time when a fictional movie was made that it was so convincing that it drove up membership of the Ku Klux Klan to the degree that it was more influential and dangerous than it had been in the height of Reconstruction? No? Forget about it, I'm just thinking out loud. First of all, a proper historian does not judge history, they seek only to understand it. Secondly, I wasn't able to find any reliable information on the claim that Birth of a Nation drove up Klan membership. I did find information that there were race riots and killings after people viewed the films, but to imply that these people would have somehow cared more for blacks had they not seen this film is ridiculous. Much the same way games don't make people more violent, movies don't make people more violent. Also, there's this great film by the same director called Intolerance. You should look it up. No one really seems to talk about it when they talk about this movie. Some games that are all sport and no story include all sports that have no story, such as rugby, hockey, JLI, or badminton. These experiences do not offer justification for their mechanics, or even context. The rules are the rules, and that's all they are. A ping pong player is simply playing ping pong. They are not representative of, for example, a mighty hero vanquishing an ancient evil. They are not recreating the Battle of Stalingrad via paddle and ball. They are not pretending to explode civilians with every swing. They are not learning valuable lessons about the cruel nature of war when the ball hits the tiny net. They may have an existential crisis about why they are playing ping pong, re the pointlessness of learning to become extremely skilled at hitting a small ball back and forth, but this is within the realm of life, not the simulated reality of a ping pong narrative. I'm going to pull out a term that will help contradict your little point here. Emergent narrative. Here's a video about it by Al Russell. Holy crap, Al Russell. I know I highly recommend you, but get off of my video. This is getting ridiculous. What was I talking about? Oh yeah. I do see what you meant to say here, so again, this is me nitpicking. Welcome to my channel. Some interactive experiences, or games, that are all story and no sports include Bell Park Youth Detective, Oren Moverman's Rampart, John Gardner's Grendel, and Eduardo Galeano's Days and Nights of Love and War. In these events, there is no skill or rules that determine the forward progression apart from the act of pressing play or turning pages or clicking one of several choice options. However, despite this simple setup, these stories are comparable in choice levels to more advanced sports games such as Uncharted or BioShock. Despite the simple setup, the narrative advancement is basically the same for these games as for the sports-free games. Also, the writing is worse. Like, Jesus, seriously, have you actually played an Uncharted game? Are you kidding me with that dialogue? Wait. Back up. Those aren't even games, they're books. And not even choose your own adventure books, they're just books. I thought we were talking about the narrative and gameplay of, games. Not the gameplay of a book that doesn't even have gameplay. So, let's say you actually gave examples of games. They are more narratively focused with a different kind of sport to drive the progression of the narrative. However, their choice levels are the same, as is the narrative advancement. Okay, so you're using a lot of non-specific words here and not explaining what they mean. Choice level? What does that even mean? How many choices there are? The importance of each choice to the narrative? How does my decision to use a sniper rifle or an M16 affect the narrative as a whole? I suppose it could define myself as more or less methodical. Seriously, what the hell are you talking about? And narrative advancement? Meaning the narrative structure? I'm pretty sure that's fairly universal across mediums. Do you mean that the narratives tend to be about the same subject matter? That the player has the same impact on the game? You know what? Making it unclear what you're talking about by not substantiating what you mean is not good essay composition. Like, Jesus, seriously, have you actually played an Uncharted game? Are you kidding me with that dialogue? I'm fairly certain that Jesus didn't play an Uncharted game. He was alive about 2,000 years ago. They didn't have PS3s. Double entendres aside, you have to give an example of what the hell you're talking about. How does an Indiana Jones-style lighthearted adventure with some elements of the narrative and interactivity that contradict each other and apparently bad dialogue compare to a damn book? Furthermore, how is it indicative of all games that have a heavier focus on sport? Even furthermore, how does that compare to any games? You're trying to talk about comparisons between books and games here, and the connection isn't being made because you're not substantiating and not using clear terms. It's just rambling. You might ask yourself at this point, what makes a game, objectively speaking? The answer is nothing. Classifications like that are an entirely human invention, and the universe doesn't really give a shit about whether something is a game or is art or whatever. Their definitions come from the notoriously shoddy English language, which some people think is a near-infallible source of categorization, when in reality it was cobbled together from like 5 different languages over the course of about a millennium or so. And that's not including all the loanwords. Fuck art. Fuck games. Who gives a shit? Uncharted is a movie where you have to pretend to shoot people with shitty guns to unlock the new sections of the movie. Who gives a shit? Fuck it. Another important part of games is level design. What the f- Okay. So, that's not true. Let me present a counterpoint by replacing your example. So some of you may be asking, what makes a cat, objectively speaking? The answer isn't nothing. Classification like that is an entirely human invention. But there are certain aspects about the cat that we can use to identify them as cats. It has the essence of a cat as opposed to the essence of a dog, a shoe, Gatorade, or Friedrich f***ing Nietzsche. Fur, mating rituals, bone structure, behavior patterns, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Carnivora, Felidae, Felice. So yes, genre and all the elements that make a game are nebulous, but to say classification is pointless because life is pointless is just plain stupid. The notoriously shoddy English language that you're using to write this essay has served a point of communication, even if you do use it rather poorly. Now, the last paragraph just kind of goes completely off the rails. I'm not gonna respond to it because I don't need to. It's literally just the guy having an existential crisis, and it's kind of sad. But here it is if you want to read it. Like I said, I take requests. If you'd like to see more videos like this, check out the rest on my channel, and I'll see you guys next time.